The transmission log was dated 3 standard cycles before the Accord signing. That detail, buried in a routine archival filing, was what first caught senior analyst Vethkar's attention, not because the date was wrong, but because the log showed no sender. A message without origin, received by every human vessel in the Shannara corridor simultaneously. Never flagged, never explained, never claimed by any human official. Just a 16-character alphanumeric string that the Galactic Oversight Bureau's best cryptographers spent 4 months decoding, only to discover it translated, in Old Terran maritime code, to a single phrase. Hold formation. Vethkara stared at those 2 words for a long time. Then she looked out her office window at the empty docking berths where the human fleet used to be, and felt the first cold thread of something she did not have a name for yet. The Accord had been presented to humanity on the 43rd day of the Conclave of Shannara, and by any objective measure, it was not a negotiation. Ambassador Sarah Voss stood at the center of the Grand Chamber, a space designed, as all conclave architecture was, to reduce its occupants to appropriate scale. The ceiling arched 300 meters above the floor. The 9 delegations of the Shannara Compact sat elevated, their viewing platforms arranged in a semicircle that ensured any speaker at the podium below looked up at everyone simultaneously. The effect was not accidental. The Compact's position is simple, said High Executor Draval, his voice translated through the chamber's harmonic array with the particular flatness that always accompanied Draval's pronouncements, not emotionless, but calibrated. Draval was Vithran, a species that had been spacefaring for 11,000 years. He had the particular patient stillness of something that had watched empires collapse and found the process professionally interesting. Humanity has been a galactic presence for 87 of your years. In that time, you have fought 4 wars, 3 of which you initiated. You have colonized 19 systems without territorial arbitration. You have introduced 3 separate biological agents into ecospheres under compact protection. You are, by every metric, an uncontrolled variable. Sarah Voss did not look up at him. She kept her eyes level, focused on the middle distance, which happened to land on the Draval delegation's lower tier. Not submissive, not aggressive. Just level. And your proposed solution, she said, is generous, given the circumstances. Draval's secondary eyes, the smaller pair set just above the primary, shifted slightly. Total disarmament of all human military assets within 6 standard cycles. A compact-administered governance council to oversee human expansion. A moratorium on independent colonization. In exchange, humanity receives full compact trade access, medical technology currently restricted to member species, and formal protection status. The chamber was very quiet. Protection, Voss said. Not a question. Just the word, placed carefully. From yourselves, primarily, Draval said, and from others who find your uncontrolled status concerning. Voss was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Vethkara would later review the footage 17 times, and on the 17th viewing she would notice something she had missed every time before, that Voss's right hand, resting flat on the podium, pressed down slightly during those 4 seconds. A small movement, the kind a person makes when they are steadying themselves against something they are not allowed to show. I'll need to consult with my government, Voss said. Of course, said Draval. You have 30 cycles. Humanity agreed in 22. The disarmament was the thing that everyone in the compact understood. It was the speed that nobody could explain. Vethkara had been a behavioral analyst for 21 years. She had studied species in transition, the Calvareth capitulation, the Murin voluntary integration, the 3 separate Drishan territorial surrenders, and in every case, there was a predictable psychological signature. Denial, resistance, internal fracturing, political actors who saw advantage in delay. Even species that ultimately accepted imposed terms almost always generated significant internal opposition that stretched the process across cycles. Humanity did it in 22 days. Not just agreed either. They moved. Decommissioning started before the ink signatures had cleared processing. Human warships began pulling back from forward positions within 48 hours of the announcement. By day 15, 3 of the 7 human fleet groups had already begun the docking protocols at compact-designated disarmament stations. They're terrified, said Vethkara's supervisor, Overseer Pelrin, when she brought him the early reports. The Accord scared them into compliance. That's what rapid capitulation looks like. I've seen rapid capitulation, Vethkara said. It doesn't look like this. What does it look like? She set the report on his desk. It looks disorganized. Panic-driven compliance always generates procedural errors, missed filings, contradictory orders. This is clean. The decommissioning sequence is perfectly staged. They're not rushing there. She stopped. They're what? Pelrin asked. She picked up the report again. Executing a prepared plan, she said slowly. Pelrin waved a primary appendage. Humans are procedurally capable. That's documented. Their military is executing a prepared plan, she said. The decommissioning sequence. It's not improvised compliance. Someone wrote this out in advance. Pelrin was quiet for a moment. Before the accord was even finalized? Possibly before the accord was proposed. She would spend the next 3 weeks trying to convince someone that this mattered. She largely failed. The compact was celebrating. The uncontrolled variable was finally under control. This was not a moment for behavioral analysts to raise uncomfortable procedural questions. And then, on Cycle 47, the First Fleet Group finished decommissioning and sailed their warships into the designated compact holding station at Farah's orbital. All 112 of them. The station's intake coordinator, a meticulous Vithran bureaucrat named Korath, filed his standard receipt and forwarded the documentation through normal channels. Vethkar received a copy because she was on the disarmament monitoring list. She almost didn't read it. The number that stopped her was not 112. It was in the footnote. Cross-referenced ship IDs against the Joint Galactic Registry. Standard procedure, done automatically by the processing system. 73 of the 112 vessels had been registered to the human military for fewer than 6 months. They weren't old warships being decommissioned. They were barely finished being built. She filed an inquiry. The inquiry was routed to a committee. The committee met in 17 cycles. By then, the Second Fleet Group had completed decommissioning, and the third was halfway through, and the Compact High Council had issued a formal commendation for humanity's unprecedented cooperative spirit. Vethkara started building a private file. It was the habit of a good analyst. Not conspiracy, just documentation. Anomalies collected against the possibility of future pattern recognition. She noted the new ships. She noted the absence of the mysterious transmission sender. She noted the speed of the accord acceptance. She noted something else, smaller, that she almost categorized as trivial. In the 87 years of human galactic presence, the human military had never once publicized its total fleet count. Every other species in the compact had registry numbers that were publicly verifiable. The Vithran published annual fleet reports as a matter of diplomatic custom. Even the historically secretive Calvareth had opened their military registration to compact oversight as part of their integration terms. Humans had resisted every attempt to establish a definitive count. The arguments were always procedural: privacy protections, national sovereignty, administrative complexity. The compact had never pushed hard enough to make it a crisis. There were enough other things to manage. It meant that when humanity surrendered 847 ships across 7 fleet groups, the compact had no baseline to compare it against. 847 ships was the number the humans said they had, and the compact accepted it because what other number could there be? Vethkara added this to her file and went back to her other work. Then a human officer named Colonel Danica Rourke walked into a compact monitoring station on Farah's orbital, sat down across from a confused Vithran administrator, and said something that should have been completely ordinary. "I'd like to report a clerical error in my decommissioning paperwork." The administrator looked up. "What kind of error?" "My secondary vessel wasn't logged," Rourke said. "I want to make sure it's properly transferred to compact custody. I don't want any irregularities in my file." The administrator pulled up Rourke's record. 1 vessel registered. A patrol craft, recently decommissioned, currently in Bay 7. Everything appeared in order. "What secondary vessel?" the administrator asked. Rourke placed a data chip on the desk. The Kestrel 9, support craft, range extended. Based out of Meridian Station. The administrator ran the ID. The Kestrel 9 came up in the registry. Decommissioned 3 weeks ago as part of the First Fleet Group. Logged correctly. No error visible. This appears to already be in our custody, the administrator said. Right, said Rourke. But it's not in my individual record. I was her commanding officer. I just want to make sure it's tied to my file for completeness. The pause. My legal team advised me to verify everything personally. The administrator made the annotation. Rourke thanked her, politely, and left. It was a mundane interaction. The administrator filed it and moved on. Vethkara received the filing in her monitoring feed because she was watching everything, and because she was the kind of analyst who read the footnotes, and because something in the phrasing, "My legal team advised me to verify everything personally," felt slightly off register. Human legal culture had specific phrases, specific rhythms. That phrase was not quite any of them. She pulled the Kestrel 9's decommissioning record. 3 weeks ago, Bay 14, Farah's orbital. Transferred to compact inventory. Signed by a compact intake officer named Varys, co-signed by the human commanding officer. She cross-referenced Varys' signature against other documents from that day. Routine. Nothing unusual. She cross-referenced the human co-signature. The name on the document was Colonel Danica Rourke. The date on the document was the same day that Colonel Danica Rourke was logged in the compact medical facility on Shannara Prime for a respiratory treatment. According to those records, she had been there for 6 hours. Farah's orbital was a 14-hour transit from Shannara Prime. She'd signed a document at a location she couldn't physically have been at. Vethkara sat back in her chair and looked at this for a very long time. Then she sent an urgent message to Overseer Pelrin marked for immediate review, and this time, 3 days later, he called her back. "Your signature discrepancy," he said. "I reviewed it. And? The medical records may be misfiled. Farah's and Shannara both use the Compact's standard health registry. There are known synchronization errors." "There are synchronization errors," she repeated, "that create false records of where a human officer was located on the day she signed a decommissioning document. It's the most likely explanation." "And the new ships? The transmission with no sender?" "Vethkara." His voice was not unkind. "You are finding patterns in noise. The disarmament is proceeding correctly. The Council is satisfied. You have no evidence of wrongdoing. You have a filing anomaly and a medical records error and a transmission that probably represents a systems glitch. Let it go." She did not let it go. The revelation, when it came, arrived not through her investigation but through an accident of catastrophic proportions on the other side of the Compact's jurisdiction. The grain sovereignty had been a problem for 30 years, a militarized isolationist state on the Compact's outer rim that had never signed any multilateral agreements and had spent decades acquiring weapons systems through irregular channels. They weren't powerful enough to threaten the Compact directly. They were powerful enough to be an ongoing nuisance, raiding shipping lanes, destabilizing border systems, and maintaining just enough plausible deniability to avoid a formal Compact response. On Cycle 91 of the disarmament year, the grain sovereignty moved against the human colony at Aldris IV. It wasn't an ambush, exactly, more a calculated exploitation of the post-Accord vulnerability window. Humanity had just handed over its military assets. Humanity's colonies on the outer rim were no longer covered by human naval patrol. The Compact had not yet deployed governance protection in those areas. For approximately 3 months, a small stretch of formerly human-defended space was, by any practical measure, undefended. The grain clearly did their math and liked the answer. 47 grain combat vessels jumped into the Aldris system at 0300 standard. They destroyed the 2 Compact observer ships that happened to be there, a provocation against the Compact itself, carefully sized to be too small to trigger an immediate Compact military response, and moved on the colony. Aldris IV had a population of 312,000 humans, a civilian administrative staff, and no military assets of any kind. By the terms of the Accord, it was required to have no military assets of any kind. The Compact High Council convened an emergency session. Deliberations on an appropriate response were projected to take 3 to 5 cycles. The grain fleet reached Aldris IV's orbital in 11 hours. And then, over the course of approximately 4 minutes, something happened that would be analyzed, reconstructed, debated, and ultimately never fully explained to the satisfaction of anyone who tried. Commander Asha Britton, ranking human officer present on Aldris IV, Technically a colonial administrator since her military commission had been formally surrendered under the Accord, sent a single message to compact authorities at the 8-hour mark, when the grain approach trajectory was locked and contact was 2.5 hours away. We have the situation managed. Please hold response forces at current positions. Then she closed the channel. Managed, said High Council Liaison Farath, staring at the message. She has 47 warships incoming and no military capability, and she says she has it managed. Nobody in the council chamber had an answer. They held response forces at current positions, partly because Farath's bewilderment had somehow transferred itself into a kind of paralysis, and partly because the response forces were 6 hours away and the math didn't work anyway. At the Compact's monitoring station with an active sensor sweep of Aldris space, a junior analyst named Oshprit was watching the grain approach on a tactical display when the passive long-range arrays started returning anomalous readings at the system's outer edge. Mass shadows. Significant ones. He adjusted the sensor parameters, thinking instrument error. The shadows didn't resolve into background noise. They resolved into more shadows, densely packed, arranged in formations that passive sensors weren't designed to properly map. He flagged his supervisor. His supervisor adjusted the sensors again, then stood very still. "What is that?" the supervisor asked. "I don't know," Oshprit said. "Is it the grain?" "The grain are already at the orbital. He did the range calculation, coming from outside the system." "How many contacts?" Oshprit ran the mass shadow count 3 times. The number changed slightly each time, depending on which reading he trusted and how he handled the overlap anomalies. The lowest reasonable estimate was 400 contacts. The highest was over 1,000. He looked at his supervisor. "Get me a line to Compact High Council," his supervisor said quietly. "Now." What happened next took 11 minutes and has been called, by subsequent historians, either the most perfectly executed strategic maneuver in recorded galactic history or proof that humanity had been operating on a completely different cognitive framework than anyone in the Compact had assumed. The fleet that emerged from the Aldris system's outer edge bore no registry markers, no identification transponders, no formal designation that matched any Compact registered vessel. They were, in the strictest technical sense, ships that did not officially exist. They moved with the precision of a single organism, the kind of coordination that required either exceptional communication technology or something that Vethkara, watching the sensor data from her office as it was urgently routed through every Compact monitoring channel simultaneously, would later describe as the most frightening word she could think of: rehearsal. They had practiced this. The grain fleet had 47 vessels and some of the best tactical commanders in the Outer Rim. They were suddenly facing a numerical opposition that had appeared from outside a sealed system, which was not possible under any conventional drive technology, had surrounded them on a vector that would have required staging from a position that should have been empty space, and showed no intention of communicating. The Grain Admiral sent an identification challenge. Standard protocol. Required by a dozen different galactic regulations that the Grain themselves hadn't signed but still used because everyone used them. The response came not on the standard hailing frequency. It came on a frequency that Grain military communication systems technically didn't support. They received it anyway, because whoever sent it had transmitted on enough adjacent bands to ensure reception through inference. The message was 2 seconds long. No words. Just an audio file of a sound that compact xenoacoustic databases identified as a Terran heartbeat. The Grain fleet began emergency withdrawal procedures. They didn't complete them. In the time it took the Grain to calculate a jump solution, the unregistered fleet had closed to engagement range and taken up positions that made any jump attempt a guaranteed collision probability of over 70%. They were boxed. Precisely, geometrically, completely boxed. Vethkara was not thinking about the Grain anymore. She was thinking about a message with no sender, dated 3 cycles before the Accord signing, telling a fleet that wouldn't publicly exist for another 6 months to hold formation. She was thinking about 73 new ships delivered to the disarmament station as if they were old ones, because the Compact didn't have a baseline count to check against. She was thinking about Colonel Danica Rourke, who had visited a monitoring station to personally verify that a ship she commanded had been properly transferred to Compact custody, and in doing so had confirmed, on official record, that she had a legally documented relationship with a vessel that was now certified as no longer hers. She pulled the Kestrel 9's compact inventory file, currently listed as sitting in Bay 14 of Farah's orbital, pending formal decommissioning review. She submitted an inspection request for Bay 14. The inspection report came back in 2 hours. Bay 14 was empty. Had been empty since the second day after the ship's logged arrival. The docking systems showed it arriving, confirmed receipt, logged standard transfer protocols. The physical bay contained no ship. How does a ship disappear from a locked compact facility? She said, very quietly, to no one in particular, without any of the docking systems logging a departure? She already knew the answer was worse than she was ready for. The Grain Sovereignty surrendered Aldris space in full within 8 hours of the fleet's appearance. They had no real alternative. The geometry of their position had been arranged so precisely that even the Grain commander, reviewing it afterward, admitted he couldn't find a scenario where they didn't lose 70+% of his fleet in any attempted breakout. Whatever these ships were, they had anticipated his exact tactical options and pre-denied all of them. The colony on Aldris 4 was untouched. Commander Asha Britton sent a second message to the compact High Council 6 hours after the Grain withdrawal began. Thank you for holding your forces. The situation is resolved. We'll begin coordinating with compact officials regarding the Grain detainees at your earliest convenience. She wrote it with the tone of someone reporting a completed administrative task. High Executor Draval, who had been awake for the entirety of this 11-hour sequence, read the message 3 times. He found, upon reflection, that the particular controlled flatness he usually maintained in his voice was not available to him in the way he normally expected. What fleet performed this action? He asked his aide. The aide had no answer. Whose ships are those? The aide had been working on exactly that question for 4 hours with 3 separate intelligence staff. They carry no registry. They respond to no identification request. By legal definition, Draval said, humanity surrendered its entire military capability during the Accord. So those cannot be human ships. The aide did not say what both of them were thinking. Get me Ambassador Voss, Draval said. Voss took the call. She looked, Draval noticed, like someone who had slept recently, not the look of a person who had just spent an anxious night watching a crisis unfold. She looked, if he was being precise, like someone who had expected this call this morning. The fleet at Aldris, Draval said. Explain it. I'm not sure I understand the question, Voss said. You surrendered your military assets. We did. Those ships are not military assets, Voss said. Her voice was completely even. They were never registered to any human military organization. They were never counted in any fleet registry. They were never declared as weapons systems under any international or galactic convention. They are, legally speaking, civilian vessels under private ownership whose operators chose, of their own independent accord, to respond to a threat against a human civilian population. The silence that followed was so complete that Vethkara, who had requested access to the communication log within the hour and received it because someone in the council had decided this needed as many analysts as possible, could hear the ambient sound of whatever room Voss was calling from. A soft hum. Climate control, she thought. Very ordinary. Private vessels, Draval said finally. That is correct. You are telling me that private human civilians own and operate warships capable of surrounding and immobilizing a 47-vessel military fleet. I'm telling you that the legal definitions were followed precisely, Voss said. Every ship humanity surrendered under the Accord was exactly what we said it was. The Accord required us to disarm. We disarmed. Ambassador. Draval's secondary eyes had stopped moving entirely, a Vithran expression that his species literature described as the cognitive state that preceded a fundamental revision of assumptions. How many ships do humans have? Voss paused. It was not the pause of someone constructing an evasion. It was, Vethkar realized much later, the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. Enough, Voss said. The compact demanded an emergency audit of all human assets, military and civilian, registered and unregistered. The demand was legitimate, technically. The Accord's language included a clause allowing compact inspection rights. Voss cooperated fully and immediately, which made 3 separate compact officials nervous for reasons they couldn't immediately articulate. Vethkara articulated it 6 hours into the audit process, in a memo to the full council that she marked urgent and that got read, finally, by people who had the authority to act on it. Humanity has complied with every demand placed upon them. They complied with the disarmament. They are complying with the audit. They cooperated with the accord process at a speed that defied behavioral modeling. And at every stage, their compliance has been so technically precise that it has revealed nothing about what we actually wanted to know. We have been interpreting their cooperation as evidence of submission. I believe we have been catastrophically wrong about what their cooperation means. Asterisk. She paused, then added the line that she had been sitting with for 2 days. I think they let us impose the accord. The audit took 11 days. What it found, 847 ships in compact custody, correctly transferred, all registration documentation in order. No evidence of additional registered human military vessels. A legal framework for human private vessel ownership that had been carefully constructed over 40 years through normal democratic processes, which incidentally made no distinction between civilian and military-grade ship classes beyond the narrowest technical definitions. A culture, documented extensively in human historical and legal records, of individual rights to self-defense that extended, under human legal theory, long established and entirely consistent, to organized collective self-defense by private citizen groups. Everything was legal. Everything had been legal before the accord. The accord had, if anything, made it more legal by removing the government military as a competing interest. The Compact High Council sat with this for a long time. They didn't hide anything, Draval said at last. His voice had the quality of something that had just passed through a transition and not come out the same. They published their legal framework. They disclosed their civilian ownership laws. All of this was available for review. We didn't know to look for it, said Council Member Thesavir. We didn't know to look, Draval said, with a precision that made the distinction feel important, because the concept of private citizens organizing a military force of this scale falls outside any strategic model any member species has operated under in recorded history. The concept does exist in human history, Vethkara said. She was in the room because someone had finally decided she should be in the room. It's an archaic institutional form. What they call a militia. Or in some historical contexts, a fleet in being. The concept is that capability exists distributed through the population rather than concentrated in state structures. We assessed it as a pre-galactic historical artifact. We didn't model it as a current strategic reality. Because no rational civilization would structure their defense that way, Thesavir said. No, Vethkara agreed. Which is exactly why it worked. She went back to the Kestrel 9 question because she couldn't stop. An empty bay. A signed transfer document. A colonel who'd been in a medical facility when she supposedly signed it. She'd been circling it for weeks and still couldn't close the loop, and the part of her brain that refused to let go of unresolved patterns was making it very difficult to sleep. She requested an interview with Rourke. She expected resistance. Rourke agreed in 4 hours. They met in a compact conference room on Shannara Prime. Rourke was 43 years old, angular and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that Vethkara associated with people who spent a great deal of time in confined spaces. She wore civilian clothes. No insignia. She was, officially, a retired military officer. Vethkara set a data chip on the table between them. Kestrel 9 star. Bay 14. Empty. Rourke looked at the chip, then at Vethkara. I reported the clerical error. It's in the record. Where is the ship? That's a question for compact inventory management. Once it transferred to your custody, Colonel. Vethkara folded her primary limbs in the gesture her species used to indicate that she was choosing to speak plainly and expected the same. I'm not building a case. I'm trying to understand something. This is a personal request from someone who has spent 3 months watching your species do something that I cannot fully explain, and I am asking you to help me understand it. Just that. Rourke was quiet for a moment. She looked at the chip again. What do you want to understand? She asked. The Kestrel 9 signature, Vethkara said. You were in the medical facility. You didn't sign that document. Someone signed it for you. Which means the transfer was deliberately documented with a provable anomaly. She paused. You wanted us to find the discrepancy. Something in Rourke's expression shifted. Not much. Just enough. We needed the audit trail to hold up, Rourke said. Her voice was careful. Not evasive. Careful, the way someone speaks when they are being more honest than they are supposed to be. The accord was always going to be reviewed. Someone was always going to check our compliance. We needed every document to be technically correct and legally sound. We needed the transfer paperwork to be real and verified. But the ship itself was never in Bay 14, Rourke said. The administrative logging said it was. The administrative logging was correct by the letter of every procedural requirement. The physical ship, she stopped, was already somewhere else, Vethkara said. Rourke said nothing. The anomaly, Vethkara said slowly. The signature discrepancy. You left it deliberately. Not to hide what you did. To create a record that drew attention to the specific document, so that when if an analyst found the empty bay, there was already a documented chain establishing that the ship was transferred. Legally transferred. Logged correctly. Just. Not physically present, Rourke said. Where is it? Rourke finally looked up and met Vethkara's eyes directly. The first time she'd done that in the conversation, Vethkara realized. You understand that this conversation has limits. I understand that. The pause. Then, find Aldris 4's sensor logs from the first 4 minutes of engagement. Find the ship with the support class mass signature running communications relay on the northeast engagement vector. That ship was doing something very specific. Something that required a range-extended support craft. Rourke's voice was completely steady. That ship was there because someone told a story with its absence. Vethkara went back to the sensor logs. The Kestrel 9 wasn't in compact custody. It never had been. It had been communications relay for the unregistered fleet, the critical link in a coordination network that had allowed hundreds of vessels to operate with the precision of a single organism. Without it, the operation didn't work. It was not a warship. The Accord hadn't required its surrender because it wasn't classified as a warship. It was a support craft with exceptional range, owned privately, operated by a retired colonel who had visited a compact monitoring station to personally verify, on the official record, that she had a documented relationship with it, one that had been correctly transferred to compact custody, on paper, in a way that would survive any subsequent legal challenge. It had never been transferred. The document was fraudulent, and the anomaly was in the document, and the anomaly was left there so that Vethkara, or someone like Vethkara, would eventually find it and in digging would find the truth. They had wanted someone to know. Not publicly. Not as an admission. She sat with this for a long time. The Compact convened its formal response session on Cycle 104. The question before the Council was deceptively simple. What, legally, could be done about the unregistered human fleet? The answer, after 11 days of review by 4 separate legal bodies, was nothing. The fleet was private. The laws were human laws, established through human democratic process, and the Accord had explicitly preserved human internal legal sovereignty. The ships had committed no violation. They had defended a civilian population from an armed aggressor, which was the legal right of any private citizen under both human law and, awkwardly, 3 separate compact precedents. We could renegotiate the Accord, Thesivir suggested. The humans would need to agree, said Draval. Would they? A silence settled over the chamber. Vethkara, attending as an advisory observer, watched Draval's secondary eyes move slowly, processing, calculating, reaching conclusions. They complied perfectly with every demand we made, Draval said at last. Every single one. Their compliance was genuine, complete, and technically total. He paused. And in complying, they removed the only assets we had identified as threats, while maintaining an undisclosed capability that we now cannot even count, because it is distributed through their civilian population in a form we cannot legally assess. Another pause. If we propose new Accord terms, they will comply with those too. And then? Thesivir asked. And then we will discover what those terms also failed to account for. Draval's voice held something Vethkara had never heard from a Vithrin in 11 years of working within compact structures. Not fear, exactly. Something more precise than fear. The specific cognitive state that occurs when a very old intelligence realizes it has been operating from the wrong model. Because they are not complying with our demands and then finding workarounds. They are complying with our demands and discovering that their workarounds were already in place long before we made the demands. The room was very quiet. Analyst Vethkara, said Draval. Your assessment. How long has humanity been planning this? She had thought about this for 3 months. She had a number. The civilian vessel ownership legal framework dates back 41 years, she said. The fleet coordination protocols were built into their private shipbuilding industries 17 years ago. I traced it through procurement records. The practice formation signals. She stopped. Drew a breath. The message with no sender that went out 3 cycles before the accord signing? I broke the timestamp encryption last week. It wasn't sent 3 cycles before the accord. The timestamp was reformatted. The original send date was 11 years ago. The chamber was so quiet she could hear her own breath. They have been building this for 11 years, she said. Before the accord was proposed. Before the compact formally classified them as an uncontrolled variable. Before most of the current human government was even in office. She looked at Draval. They didn't plan this in response to our demands. We issued our demands into a situation that was already planned. Draval's secondary eyes went still again. They anticipated us, he said. They anticipated someone, Vethkara said. I don't think they knew it would be us specifically. I think they looked at what kind of species they were, and what kind of galaxy this is, and they decided that someday someone powerful would try to take their ability to defend themselves. And they made sure that no matter what that looked like legally, the underlying capability would remain. That, said Draval, very slowly, is not how rational actors plan for long-term security. No, she agreed. It isn't. She thought of Voss at the podium. The hand pressing flat. The 4 seconds. She thought of Rourke in the conference room, telling her where to look. She thought of Commander Britton, saying we have the situation managed with the tone of someone reporting a completed administrative task, 2.5 hours before a fleet that didn't legally exist appeared from empty space. High Executor, she said. I have been trying to identify what category of strategic actor humanity represents. What framework applies to them? And I have spent 3 months concluding that the honest answer is, none of the ones we have. She folded her limbs carefully. The closest parallel I can find is in their own historical record. They call it strategic patience. The practice of accepting a temporary disadvantageous condition while maintaining an intact capability for an indefinite future time, without knowing when or whether that capability will ever be needed. Accepting suffering in advance, Thesivir said, for a contingency that may never arrive. Yes, that's irrational. Vethkara thought of a species that had fought 4 wars in 87 years. A species that had colonized 19 systems and introduced biological agents and pushed against every edge of galactic order with the relentless creativity of something that had survived by refusing to stop. A species that had stood in a chamber designed to make them feel small and agreed to disarm in 22 days and then spent 6 months smiling pleasantly while the compact congratulated itself. I keep trying to apply that word to them, she said. I'm not sure it fits. The compact and humanity eventually reached a new framework. Not an accord. That word was retired from the process by mutual informal agreement. A partnership document. The terms were negotiated over 14 cycles, and Voss led the human delegation with the same level, controlled attention she had shown in the original chamber, and the final document was signed with ceremony and genuine warmth on both sides. It included, at Vethkara's recommendation, a formal provision acknowledging that the compact's assessment frameworks for human strategic behavior required ongoing revision. She thought it was the most honest thing the compact had ever written. The Kestrel 9 was never officially located. Its compact transfer documentation was never formally challenged. On paper, it remains in Bay 14 of Farah's orbital to this day. Vethkara suspects this is a courtesy, a small piece of deliberate ambiguity left in place so that both sides can, if needed, say they don't know. She found, in the end, that she didn't mind. On the day the partnership document was signed, she received a message. No sender listed. Just a 6-character string that she decoded herself, out of habit, because she had gotten very good at decoding human things. Well found. She sat with that for a long time too. She had spent 4 months looking for the thing humanity had hidden from the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. She had found it, and they had wanted her to find it, and the finding had changed nothing about the outcome because the outcome had been arranged before she started looking, and the arrangement had been made 11 years before the question was even asked. The galaxy had demanded human disarmament. The humans had listened carefully, complied completely, and remained exactly as dangerous as they had always been, in ways that the compact's legal architecture had no instrument to measure, because the instruments had been designed by minds that assumed capability lived in the weapons a civilization declared, not in the people who decided to build a second set and never tell anyone. Somewhere, in the outer rim, in a civilian docking bay that appeared on no registry, a support craft with extended range and a name that existed in compact records but not in physical space sat quiet and unhurried, waiting for the next time someone would need it. Vethkara closed the message, put her file away, looked out the window at the docking berths, now full again with compact vessels going about ordinary business. She thought about what it meant to be a species that planned for the day someone came for you, not with anger, not with paranoia, but with the patient, practical certainty of a civilization that had learned, somewhere in its long and violent history, that no arrangement of words and signatures had ever reliably replaced the simple fact of being prepared. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. The Vithran had 11,000 years of spacefaring civilization. The Calvareth had weapons systems that could sterilize planets. The Compact's combined military dwarfed anything humanity had publicly acknowledged. But somewhere in the gap between acknowledged and actual, humanity had built something that even Vethkara, who had spent her career finding patterns in exactly that kind of gap, had needed 3 months and a deliberate breadcrumb trail to find. She suspected that somewhere, in a meeting room very much like the one where Rourke had told her where to look, humans were already planning for the next gap. The galaxy had never encountered a species that treated its own submission as a tactic. It didn't know what to do with one yet.